Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our event here on Crowdcast. This is a Library and Labyrinth live stream event, an event where the library coordinates with our local bookstore, Labyrinth, to host authors. And in this case, we also are very fortunate that this is Princeton University Press is helping us with this event and co-sponsoring it, and they're the publisher of the book tonight, Jennifer Carlson's Policing the Second Amendment, Guns, Law Enforcement, and the Politics of Race. So just a few housekeeping items before we bring our guest up on screen. She is going to be in conversation with Michael Sierra-Arévalo, and I'll introduce him in a moment. So one thing is that you can notice that there is a handy green button on the screen, which you can just click, and that will bring you right to Labyrinth's site to order the book. And if you order it and put in the promo code Carlson, you get 10% off. If you're in town and you would like to pick it up, you can let them know that. You can just call the store and give them the code over the phone, or just send them an email and say, I'll do curbside pickup, and then you'll avoid the shipping costs. And at this time, it's just so important for us to support our independent and local bookstores whenever we can, and Labyrinth is one of the best. The other thing is, right now you can see that we have the chat open. I've been putting some announcements in there. But we will close the chat for the main portion of the talk, and then we'll open it up again at the end when we go to the Ask a Question. Speaking of Ask a Question, there's a little spot down there where you can ask your questions at any point in the talk. Don't have to wait till the end. Just drop your questions in there. You can go and look, and you can also upvote other people's questions so we can see what most people are interested in doing during the question and answer. So I think that is about all of our housekeeping items. And except if you're having any technical difficulties, you can see under where it's counting how long we've been live, that there's a little place there where you can get audio visual help, and so you can always click on that. So in just a moment, I'm going to be bringing up the discussant who will introduce Jennifer to us. So it's my pleasure to be welcoming Professor Michael Sierra-Arévalo to the screen. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. His research shows how danger and violence influence police culture, officer practice, and social inequality. His first book, Peril on Patrol, is under advanced contract at Columbia University Press. His writing and research have appeared in many publications, including Washington Post, ProPublica, HuffPost, NPR, Vox, and the New Republic. He received his PhD in sociology from Yale and his BA in sociology and psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. So at this point, it is my great pleasure to bring Michael on stage, and let me unmute you. Okay, you're here. Welcome, and I'm going to go off stage, and we'll bring Jennifer up as you introduce her.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Janie. And good evening, everyone, and welcome to this author talk on Dr. Jennifer Carlson's newest book, Policing the Second Amendment. I'm very excited to be here to discuss Dr. Carlson's wonderful new book with all of you. So by way of introduction, Dr. Carlson is an associate professor at the University of Arizona, where she holds joint appointments in the Department of Sociology as well as the School of Government and Public Policy. Broadly speaking, her excellent research, published in a host of various outlets, both academic and popular, focuses on how guns shape American life, including those who survived gun violence's harrowing aftermath, gun sellers and retailers who were on the front lines of surges in gun purchasing, and the people who choose to own and carry guns as tools of safety and security. The topic of tonight's author talk, of course, is her second book, Policing the Second Amendment, in which Dr. Carlson turns to the intersection of firearms with another uniquely complicated social issue in the United States. That is, of course, policing. Now, more than half a century ago, police scholar Egon Bittner wrote that the police serve as a mechanism for the distribution of coercive force, that they are the or else of society. And though they weren't always armed, it is certainly the case that contemporary policing's function as society's or else is deeply tied to the firearms that we now see on officers' duty belts. At the same time, the United States and its police officers wrestle with a gun violence problem that is unique to industrialized countries. There are more firearms than people in the United States, and in just the past year, we have seen record sales of firearms to private citizens driven by political tumult, insecurity, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Policing and firearms are locked in a deadly symbiotic relationship. While police will argue that they depend on their firearms to stay safe and to protect the public, many are diametrically opposed to restricting Second Amendment rights. Amidst this sort of stalemate, the reality of race and racism persists. In past months, we have already seen heavily armed white militias and private citizens take over state buildings with nary an arrest or use of force. Meanwhile, the possession or even the suspicion of possession of a firearm is very often used as justification in the shooting and killing of Black Americans and other minority individuals across the U.S. Drawing on local and national newspapers, interviews with close to 80 police chiefs, and a rare look at gun licensing processes, Dr. Carlson's book, Policing the Second Amendment, explores how police talk about guns, how firearms are regulated in different parts of the country, and how this shapes police officers' understanding and pursuit of public safety. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Carlson so we can engage in a discussion about this wonderful new work. Thank you for being here tonight, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Janie, for introducing us and making all of this happen with this event. Thank you, Michael, for a wonderful introduction. And for, I'm very excited about the conversation we're about to have.
Awesome. So to get us started then, just to kick us off, your book touches on so many important topics: policing, race, special interest groups like the NRA, laws and policies around firearms. There's a lot of stuff going on here. It's a convoluted story. From the outside in particular, it's a lot to kind of dig into. So for those of us that haven't yet had a chance to read through this excellent work, can you sort of set the stage? Give me a 10,000-foot view of what you hope readers come away with after they have finished reading Policing the Second Amendment.
Sure. So this book actually really grows out of the research from my first book, which was on Michigan gun carriers. So people in predominantly Metro Detroit who chose to open carry guns, concealed carry guns. I interviewed gun carriers, gun instructors, trying to make sense of sort of pro-gun politics on the ground. And one of the striking things that I found in the research for that book was this divergence across race with regard to how gun carriers saw themselves vis-a-vis the police. So Michigan is actually really interesting. It's one of these states that if you break down by race who has a concealed pistol license, it's actually equal across race with regard to white gun carriers versus African-American gun carriers. And so what I found was that despite that similarity in rates, the way that they talked about guns and the way that they thought about guns vis-a-vis the police was strikingly different. White gun carriers overwhelmingly saw themselves as the police's helpers, as people that they saw themselves as people that the police should be happy to see that they're armed, that they're helping the police do their jobs, that they're assisting in sort of the broad project of maintaining social order in their communities. African-American and gun carriers of color, though, had a very different take. They saw their guns as a stopgap for under-policing, so the threat of violence that they experienced in their communities, but also a means of criminalization, of harassment, of excessive surveillance if they would be stopped by police. So I had one gun carrier say something along the lines of, police stop me, and they basically asked me, I have your guns now, where are your drugs? So this idea of how guns, very much sort of illustrating how guns are seen as sort of this mark of criminality in the hands of an African-American man as opposed to a white man with a concealed pistol license. And obviously we've seen this play out with high-profile cases, such as, just comparing the case of Philando Castile, who was killed by police pretty much on site, versus Kyle Rittenhouse, who was basically given words of appreciation before going on, while he was openly armed and before going on to kill protesters at a Black Lives Matter protest recently in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So this raised all sorts of questions about not just how policing actually looks like for people who carry guns but are located in very different social positionalities, but also how police themselves make sense of this. So do police actually see gun carriers as the helpers that white gun carriers that I interviewed generally thought that they were. And so I basically, that's where the book started. As you mentioned, I interviewed police chiefs. I reviewed, sort of tried to get a historical story of the relationship between the NRA and the police community. I also observed gun boards, which are kind of this odd thing. One of the issues with trying to understand racial disparities, for example, in gun law enforcement with regard to who, not just who is criminalized, but also who is given the prerogative to be able to carry a gun, is that the NRA has worked really hard to seal gun records so that you cannot FOIA them and you cannot see how decisions are actually made in terms of gun registration, concealed pistol licensing, and that sort of thing. So these gun boards, which no longer exist actually in Michigan, were a way for me to kind of actually observe. And it was pretty striking. It was pretty striking in terms of just the sheer disparity in the treatment of African Americans, particularly African American men who are called to this board as opposed to whites. And so what I do with the book is try to rethink the terms of the gun debate through this prism of race, and race from at the intersection of policing and public law enforcement and gun violence and gun policy. And so sort of the big takeaway from the book is that despite the fact that we have been told that, we have a gun debate in this country, and that debate is about basically gun control versus gun rights, and you're on one side of it or the other, and it's sort of a zero-sum debate. With the loss on one side is a gain on the other, and vice versa. What I argue in the book is that we actually need to be thinking about different ways in which race shape imaginaries around legitimate violence. And so the terms that I propose are gun populism and gun militarism. And we can dig into what those actually mean. But basically, my argument is that rather than seeing the pro-gun versus, the gun rights versus gun control side, we can actually come to some pretty surprising and somewhat uncomfortable realizations about how gun policy on both sides of the debate, but more recently, predominantly on the gun rights side, has been used in the service of racial inequality in this country.
That's fascinating. Thank you for that summary, Jennifer. Now, one thing as a fellow policing scholar that we know after now decades of confirming this again and again and again is that policing is, on the one hand, an occupation that very much deals in human suffering. Officers will see the most dire of circumstances, suffering that many people are very lucky to not know exists and will not experience themselves or see in the quantity and severity that officers will see it. But the chiefs that you spoke to, they seem to emphasize above all else gun violence. And it seems very central to how they see themselves, how they see their profession, how they see the job of the officers under their command, even though they are dealing with things like substance abuse, mental illness, poverty, housing insecurity far more often. And when they do deal with violence, it's most often not gun violence. It's low-level disputes between roommates, between family members. I'm curious what you think after talking with all these chiefs across the country. What is it that drives this emphasis among police chiefs on violence, especially gun violence specifically, above everything else? What does it say about our system of policing that it's so concerned with gun violence and not, say, any of the other far more numerous social problems that police actually deal with on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And there are so many layers to peel away with that question. Everything from, not just that police see a lot of suffering, but what suffering they see and in what context they see suffering. That's one thing that was really striking in my research, that the suffering of victims of gun violence was articulated in a very different key depending on the context of that, and what the sort of tropes used to describe that gun violence. Right. So, gun violence from, in the context of sort of these tropes of racist tropes of urban gun violence, gangbangers, drug dealers, that sort of thing, that is discussed very differently than sort of the gun violence and the the realities of victimization with respect to active shootings, to mass shootings. So I think even that question of suffering is just opens a box that we could discuss for an hour. But I want to get to your actual question, which is this question of why police seem so focused on gun violence. Now, of course, part of the reason is because I asked them about gun violence. I was asking them, so obviously in some ways it's because I put that there and I put that central, which is always something good to keep in mind, that we're, as authors and researchers, we're actually creating the parameters of what we're studying and focusing that viewpoint. But I think that there are a couple of ways that guns actually are really central to policing in the United States. So the Bittner quote that you opened up with, that, police are the institution for the distribution of situationally justified legitimate violence. That is a super powerful way that police are not just understanding themselves, but how police are imagined in popular American society, right? So, we can think of police dramas, we can think about how police are covered in the news. The what else that you mentioned, that is so central to what we think of when we think of the role of police. Even as you mentioned, there's so many other things that police do. But it's this kind of a capacity for coercive force, for violence, either in the form of a gun fired, a gun threatened, an arrest. All of those are coercive force. So there's that. I think that there's also, and this obviously goes into your work about sort of the centrality of danger as this sort of focal point for policing, because it's a way to sort of deal with not the ever presence of danger, but the ever presence of the threat of danger in policing, and sort of a way to negotiate how officers actually deal with that. And I think that, going back to this comment that you said about, police are exposed to so much human suffering, and that's the case. And we have very little in the way within our policing institutions and policing agencies with regard to helping them actually deal with that, right? We don't have adequate mental health services, period, in this country, but and police are part of that dynamic as well. They're not getting adequate mental health services with regard to what they're exposed to. And so what do they have? They have at their disposal the same tools that we have in society more generally, this sort of these tropes of sort of protectionist masculinity that tell us that the guy who saves the day with the gun is the hero that we can celebrate and applaud. And it's interesting that actually when we think about sort of the centrality of gun violence for police, it's very much the same as the centrality for gun violence for gun carriers, right? Like they're also moving through a world where gun violence is statistically, compared to all the other problems that they are going to be facing throughout their everyday lives, it is an anomaly, and they recognize that it's a rare event, but they don't want to be, they'd rather have one and not need it, have a gun, than need it and not have it. And so I think in some ways, and this is a point I make in my book, there's this very fascinating percolation between the police world and the gun culture world. And even when I was interviewing police chiefs, I had to catch myself, because I was like, I'm not talking to you as an armed private civilian. I'm talking to you as a police chief. But they would slip into that discourse of, their off-duty guns as tools of self-defense, but also tools of public order as, part of their police duties and that sort of thing. And then the last thing I can say in terms of thinking about the centrality of guns to policing and how it really relates to the book and what I discuss in the book is actually we can find a historical story to that. So as you mentioned, police have not always been armed, even if they were allowed or encouraged to use or carry guns as part of their duties. This idea of police having a standard issue pistol, revolver, a shotgun, a patrol rifle, that's all really historically pretty new. That did not really become in vogue for police departments to do this until the early 20th century. And one of the organizations that actually helped facilitate this was the National Rifle Association. So in the 19-teens and 1920s, the NRA actually did a lot of work to popularize the notion that police should not just be armed, but that they should also have that they should be trained. So this idea of police qualification, police qualifying on their firearms, which is a very sort of taken for granted thing, that the NRA was a huge proponent of that in the 19-teens. So actually, when we think about sort of the connection between guns and policing, it's all of, it's a lot of things, but the NRA actually surprisingly plays a role historically in tightening that connection.
And this brings me to another question that I had, and I think it's a topic that anyone that is even tangentially interested in firearms, the problem or the topic of firearms in the US, the NRA is the next thing out of their mouths. The NRA is a big part of the story. It has to be a big part of the story when the footprint is so large in politics and just our general understanding of the players in this drama of American gun violence. And so you point out in the book that the history of the NRA with policing has not always been the friendliest. In fact, there were very contentious moments, such as when the NRA was openly advocating for people to be able to own whatever ammunition they wanted, including quote unquote cop killer, these armor piercing rounds that the NYPD was very against average citizens owning. But now we're at a place where police officers represent one of the staunchest, most dependable blocks of NRA donors. And the NRA even provides political support and monetary resources to law enforcement agencies across the US. Can you elaborate on why these ties exist between the NRA and contemporary policing in such a strong way, and what the implications of that alliance are for the future of policing and maybe the future of gun violence in the US more generally?
Yeah, so there's a lot there to unpack. And so, as I mentioned, early 20th century, the NRA was already sort of thinking about encouraging police to have standard issued guns, get training on their guns. And this was something that wasn't actually really surprising in terms of what the NRA was doing at that time. This is pretty well known that the NRA had a really big transformation over the course of the 20th century in terms of becoming the hardline gun rights organization that it is today. So at the dawn of the 20th century, the NRA was very much focused on, police training, military training, hunter safety, that sort of stuff. Actually, one of the reasons why it moved to DC was not so that it could be well positioned as a political lobby, but because it wanted to make sure that its ties to the military were strong. And those ties were really, holding competitions, training, all that sort of thing. And so when the 1960s hit, I think that there was, to some extent, nobody really knew how to make sense of what became the problem of gun violence. So, we have such sort of almost tired ways of talking about this problem, and we're so familiar with it as a sort of paradigmatic problem in the United States. But that wasn't, the way all the sides would kind of fall and congeal, that wasn't very clear in the 1960s. And so even within the NRA, there was a lot of sort of tension around what they would do and how, what did it mean to be an organization like the National Rifle Association, organized around not just hunter safety and training and that sort of thing, but also Second Amendment rights, which became a louder and louder part of what the organization was doing. So in 1960, I believe it was, the NRA actually founded a formal organization, a formal arm within their organization to reach out to law enforcement. And so that's blossomed, even though it hasn't always been front and center in terms of the NRA's lobbying activities. And this is actually, kind of a broader point about the NRA, is that people who are outside of gun culture often think of the NRA and they think, bulldog lobbying organization, but they do so much more than just that. And all of those things sort of feed together in terms of their broader project of pursuing Second Amendment rights. And so with regard to police, as you mentioned, the NRA, they produce print material aimed at public law enforcement and military. They have actual grants that they give to police departments for training, for equipment. They have competitions, they have awards, they have line of duty death insurance. They have a lot of different ways to sort of get public law enforcement connected to the organization. So what happened in the 1960s happens, things are kind of unclear. There's a lot of sort of there's kind of this general sense that law enforcement is in favor, being conservative, being sort of traditionally oriented, hunting oriented, that law enforcement is generally more on the side of the NRA than not. But there isn't this kind of hardcore alliance, and that gets broken asunder in the 1980s and into the 1990s when Daryl Gates basically aggressively argues on behalf of gun control advocacy. He is one of the key players in terms of why not only California had an assault weapons ban, but also why a federal assault weapons ban came into play in the early 90s. And even though we often refer to that law as the assault weapons ban, it actually was a broad crime law that a criminal justice law that did not just ban guns, but also gave money to police, in order, presumably, for community policing initiatives. And so there was a lot of sort of, police were very much sort of embedded in that. Okay, so what happens then after after that moment in order for police to shift? Part of that is the NRA being very smart about building organizational ties with the Fraternal Order of Police. Part of that is starting their own organizations that are pro-police, pro-Second Amendment organizations. Part of that is also police actually becoming more concerned about the issue of active shootings and being very much taken in with this sort of first responder approach to active shootings that situated not just them, because in the past, before Columbine, it was, active shootings are dealt with SWAT. You contain and wait. If you're a patrol officer, you do not go in. You wait until SWAT comes and does what they've been specially trained to do. That was thrown out the window with Columbine, and with it, sort of this openness. Well, part of what that entailed was an openness to first responders in all forms, including private armed civilians. And then the last piece that I found absolutely fascinating, and this was particularly the case in California, that gun control laws themselves, because of the way police were uniquely sort of implicated in them, both enforcing them and seeing them as a quote unquote enforcement nightmare, but also having certain gun rights as police, what they saw as gun rights as police, by virtue of being police, they were exempted from certain gun restrictions, and then losing those exemptions upon retirement, that also sort of opened up the door to rethinking their position on gun politics. And then, I think the last piece of this is that the NRA has done a great job of, not just aligning the Republican Party to gun rights, but also expanding the gun rights platform and connecting it to issues about, protests and Black Lives Matter, issues related to immigration. If you watch NRA media now, you could very easily be forgiven for not recognizing that they're a Second Amendment organization, because they seem to span the gamut in terms of conservative politics. So that also is part of this shift. So it's a complicated shift, and it's a bit paradoxical, because of course police are on the front lines of enforcing gun laws, and they're the ones on the front lines of actually dealing with gun violence, as you noted at the onset of the talk.
Right. And it's an interesting note. You mentioned how complicated it is. Daryl Gates, before he became chief, was instrumental in the formation of SWAT in the first place. So there's this oddity historically where someone who actually was in many ways the forefather of the shift towards militarized policing, kind of building that framework, was also at the same time advocating for a restriction on firearms. And one of those things stayed.
Yeah. And I think that's why the focus on race is so crucial. And that's where, that's a perfect illustration of what I talk about as gun militarism. So this idea of, how do we think about the place of guns in society? They are for police to, and laws should be written so that police have access to firepower that allows them to aggressively confront, disarm, overpower the enemy, which in that case was very clearly, what police conjured as, these, in terms of these racist tropes of gangbangers, drug dealers, and that sort of thing. And so, Yeah, if you actually look at what Daryl Gates was arguing, today when we talk about assault weapons, we are talking, when someone proposes an assault weapon ban, it's really focused on we need to protect victims, we need to, and the images of Sandy Hook and Parkland and that sort of thing come to mind. But that was not at all sort of the moral economy of victimhood that Daryl Gates was tapping into. He was specifically talking about police being gunned down, and really embedded this call for an assault weapons ban in the context of what he characterized as a all-out urban war on violence.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question between you and I, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. One of the interesting features of your sample analytically is that you got to talk to people at the very top of the organizational chain, right? So in some cases, it's a fascinating sample in and of itself because you have people that actually have sort of a top-down view. They're likely to have a better understanding of the intricacies of certain policies and the realities of certain political pressures. They've actually been in policing for a longer time. Mm-hmm. What, to your mind, is the unique value of getting to sit down with chiefs who, in many cases, haven't actually been in a patrol car in many, many years? They're not actually the ones out there doing it in some cases. What do we learn from chiefs specifically that lets us better understand this unique intersection of policing and firearms?
Yeah, so, it's always difficult to figure out how you're going to study something that, policing, we know, is fragmented across the US. There are thousands of police agencies. They are very similar in some ways, but differ dramatically in other ways. Gun laws as well are very different across states. That's actually why I look at Arizona, California, and Michigan, because they are three wildly different legal contexts for the regulation of guns. And so one of the issues that I came up to, in thinking about the study and trying to design how would I rigorously be able to answer these questions and be able to show what I think is going on based on my kind of sensibilities from my research from my first book. And so typically, and I know you've done this work, in-depth ethnographic work of police agencies is often what policing scholars do. The amazing part of that is that you often get a sense of top to bottom what the dynamics of that agency are. You get an in-depth, rich view of sort of the texture of policing and how it relates to very localized dynamics. It's very illuminating. But the problem with that is that it's often the case that those studies tend to emphasize large urban, LA, Chicago, New York, or policing agencies that should be studied because they're huge and powerful and obviously set the tone for other policing agencies and certainly for the people who are living in those communities. But they don't get at the overall reality of what they don't get at the texture of policing across different kinds of jurisdictions. So that's actually the things that you already said. Talking to someone who has lots of history with policing, who can tell me about how changes in gun laws affected how they thought about gun violence and their own guns. They are used to thinking about these issues because they are interfacing with the public. They are in the position where they can set policy, and it is fascinating to think about. And I talk to them about this when they are willing to advocate for certain policies from the level, the top brass level that they sit at, versus when they are not, and when they say that officers simply must decide for themselves, which is a very interesting way that they frame the use of force among police officers, but we can talk about that during the Q&A. But the last and final really big piece is that by talking to police chiefs, I was able to actually compare across really different jurisdictions and come up with a story that I was really confident was not just something that was going on in LA, not just something that was going on in Detroit, but was actually that this was not just a few chiefs who were stridently pro-gun, but actually this captured something about policing and how policing is organized today vis-a-vis gun violence and lawfully owned guns by civilians.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I think that we're at a point where we're going to begin to transition to Q&A. I am looking for questions. Janie, can you guide us to our Q&A at this point? I think you might be muted, Janie.
So here I am muted. I was just saying that, Michael, we lost your video feed, so I have you kind of on the smaller corner here. You're still with us. I think your connection might not be stable. We haven't had any questions from the audience yet, and I'm encouraging them to do so. Sometimes people are just a little bit shy to get going. I wanted to ask you, though, maybe we could talk about how the events of, your books are published. It takes many years of research, and how the events of the last couple of months have affected your research or your outcomes or your views on, both gun violence and policing. I mean, this is a hot topic right now. There's many people who are calling for defund the police, defund, reform in the police. And how is this kind of intersecting with your book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the police abolitionist movement, Black Lives Matter, there is a lot like that. That is all sort of part of what this book is oriented toward, is really thinking through and pushing those debates so that they are not just debates about the police, but also debates about gun violence. And so this is something that I think up until very recently, it's been very difficult to put both of those two issues in conversation with one another. This idea that police violence is gun violence, that is something that for the first time I've seen tweeted from a gun violence prevention group. I think Moms Demand Action, the Brady campaign, they started to talk about gun violence in those terms. And I think that, part of that, there's two things going on. One is there is this embedded racial politics of gun violence and this tendency to, on both sides of the debate, kind of talk about good gun law in terms of, enforce gun laws against the quote unquote bad guys. Nobody wants to take away, the shotgun from the good guy with the gun. And yet what that actually means on the ground is not as clear. It is not as, it's very much mirrors sort of the war on drugs in terms of racial disparities of who actually is, who is harassed, who is arrested, who is brought to trial, sentenced, and ultimately has to pays for possession of guns, much like the possession of drugs. So I think that is, so there's that level, but then I think there's also the issue of police being, up until I think, frankly, maybe even this summer, very prized allies in the debate, that both sides have courted law enforcement, have worked really hard to court law enforcement. In fact, that was one of the coups in the 1980s with Daryl Gates that, and I mean, headlines across newspapers were constantly sort of said this line of like, it's so surprising that police are the conservative police are allying with the liberal, gun control movement. But this is the one case where, law and order transcends partisanship. And I think that's also, so kind of letting go of police as this kind of sought after ally, I think is clearly something that the gun rights side, at least the NRA, has not done. But I think that the gun control side is starting to do that. And so that's been a really big shift that happened actually between when I wrote the book and when the book actually came out.
Yeah. And how much of that do you think is related back then to the Breonna Taylor case?
Oh, in terms of, I mean, I think that there are, so in terms of her partner thinking that there's, there was a break-in and then I don't think that it's, I think it's a broader concern. So I would actually think it goes back to the Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, and those parents who mobilized to have their children viewed as worthy victims of gun violence, despite a legal context that certainly their killers thought gave them the right to murder. But not in the case of Michael Dunn, but in the case of George Zimmerman, also the legal system acquitted as well. And so I think that actually, and that's actually the origin of Black Lives Matter. That's where the hashtag came from, the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And so this, so in some ways, it's coming full circle in terms of having police violence being recognized as gun violence by these, gun violence prevention organizations. So I would actually put it further back than that.
Right. Okay. So we do have a question from the audience who says, the audience member has written, It is disturbing to read about what white police personnel appear to do. Are a large number of white police drawn from a particular subset or subsets of the population and are they pro-social or antisocial in your view?
Okay, so I'm not quite sure what you mean by antisocial or pro-social. I actually think that there is a lot of utility in thinking about the idea of populism. We hear sort of populism a lot, often attached to nationalism or, that kind of populism. We had a lot of debates about that, obviously in 2016 with the rise of the very surprising rise of, for example, Trump. So populism, though, the way I think about it in the context of the book is really centered on sort of this, in some ways, communitarian ideology of, this almost Republican, and I'm not talking about the Republican Party, but sort of the Republican ideology. So, this idea that people should be involved in, that everyday citizens should be involved in pursuing social order, and this is part of civic virtue and this sort of thing. So there's a sort of communitarian element to how white police chiefs that I talked to thought about gun violence. So they would say things like, I want good citizens, good law-abiding citizens to be armed. I want to, even chiefs that were maybe apprehensive about gun access would even say things like, yeah, if I'm, one of the chiefs said, if I'm getting my butt kicked, I want an armed private civilian to be there to help me out. So on the one hand, there's this kind of, there's this marking out and this surprising blurring between the police world and the private armed citizen world, but the sort of way that it becomes populist is that it's this sort of narrow definition of community. So, if you listen closely to what police were actually saying to me, it was often shrouded in sort of these tropes of white middle-class respectability. So the teacher with a gun, the rancher with a gun, the normal people who live at 22 Cottage Lane. And so I think that's where a lot of this sort of, these lines are drawn. And so it's more complicated than just police think of themselves as a military force policing communities like a military grid, which is certainly the case in certain communities. We see that dynamic, but it's not the case in all communities. And when we don't talk about the side of whiteness and how whiteness inflects policing, not only are we misunderstanding sort of the whole picture of policing, which whiteness has been central to the institution of policing, not just since its formal founding, but in the historical precursors in the United States to policing, but we also run the risk of actually creating sort of consensus around police reforms that in fact reproduce models of policing that are actually quite problematic. Okay, so that was the part about pro-social versus antisocial. In terms of policing background, so the police that I talked to were very homogenous because they were police chiefs. And so they are of a very particular generation. And I think it's really important actually to wrap our minds around that even as calls for, diversifying police, which there's a lot of debate about whether that actually does anything in terms of changing policing outcomes. But even in terms of, the figures that we have about, more women, more people of color involved in policing in this country, in fact, that echelon of top brass is very homogenous. It's white middle-aged men, and that's kind of the reality of the people that I was interviewing. And in terms of their biographies, I mean, a lot of that they're obviously policing. That's their life's career. I asked about their biographies and how they got into policing. And, there's kind of the tropes about, that they even joked about, oh, I wanted to help people and save the world, or, oh, I wanted to be the guy who was able to carry the gun. I don't know. I mean, this is a debate that my research, frankly, was not in a really good position to answer, but there is a really important debate about whether police are attracted to law enforcement. There are certainly stories of, new officers requesting certain beats because of racist attitudes that they have. We know this anecdotally, at least, and we've seen this. I mean, this has been covered in the media. But then there's also this question of police agencies themselves socializing socializing new recruits who, maybe wouldn't have come in with these views, but now adopt them as sort of the terms of the job, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier on, about sort of this, the dramatization of danger, and sort of danger as as this way of making sense, making not just professional sense, but also moral sense of what police do as officers of the law.
Okay, and here's another question. Thank you. That was a really great answer. So we have another question, and it says, such a wonderful talk. Thank you both. I'm wondering if Jennifer can share what can we as community members can do to change our language around gun talk and gun violence. Is there a way we can activate this language to encourage greater discussion about police, race, and violence in the U.S. today?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I actually think that that's a super powerful thing that we can all do, is to sort of refuse the terms of the gun debate that we have been given, which tells us basically that, there's two sides, and it's a policy issue. It's an issue of passing law. This is also something that I think is really illuminating once you actually look at how laws are not just passed, which there's obviously a lot we can say about that, but how laws are actually implemented on the ground. We can pass whatever package we want, and that package will only mean what it means to the people who are implementing those laws. And so thinking about how we engage with sort of what, not just policy, but also the practical politics of how gun policy is actually implemented. That's a first step in sort of shifting the debate. I also think letting go of the terms gun control versus gun rights, not that we can't talk about those terms, but I and this is the big takeaway of the book, is that I think that talking about these in terms of different ways of conceptualizing the role of legitimate violence in society, I think that there is, and this is the case with both debates about police and debates about gun violence, which is that there is this sort of contradiction, and this goes right back to Egon Bittner, in the heart of any democratic order. There is some institution that is charged with legitimate violence. And so now we can, and I ask my students this every semester, like, is it possible that we can get out of this paradox, or can we just manage it? And they all say, we can't get out of it. We have to just manage it. And so we can think about our imaginations and how perhaps that's a narrow way of thinking about it. But as it stands, thinking about it from that perspective no longer makes it about gun rights versus gun control. But if we see this sort of social necessity of having legitimate force somehow contained and managed within society, how is that possibly going to look, especially given that if we look at the history of legitimate violence in this country, it is absolutely wrapped up with the promotion of white supremacy and the reproduction of racial inequality. So I think that keeping the conversation about race and being willing and open to acknowledge when either side of the debate has sort of walked back on their promises or the potential of that side because of racism and racist approaches to this issue, I think is crucial. And then the last piece that I think is absolutely important is, and I'm happy to talk about whiteness and being a white woman who studies this, what that means. That's a really interesting set of questions. But I think that it's really important to also recognize that people of color, women, have historically not had much of a seat at the table in terms of having a voice in policy debates on the issue of guns or the issue of policing. And yet, when we look at some of the most promising action that is not just politically feasible, but actually effective, it is gun violence prevention initiatives at the community levels, by involving the people who are most directly involved with concentrated gun violence. And so I'm thinking of organizations like Youth Alive, the Violence Interrupters. They are doing amazing work that we never think of or talk about as gun policy or gun politics, because we oftentimes have this very sort of narrow view of what gun policy and what change can actually look like.
Oh, that was great. And we have Michael back with us now. He'd lost his video for a bit. So yay, this is great. Just in time for the closing. Is there anything else that either of you want to say before we say goodnight to everybody? It's been a really lively and wonderful discussion. Any other closing comments that we can think of, Michael or Jennifer?
I will just say on behalf of Jennifer and her book, for anyone that is interested in firearms or in policing, or in my opinion, anybody that wants to understand this country, that wants to understand some of the core problems that we have wrestled with since the inception of the nation, this is necessary reading. This is a text that is accessible, that is going to allow you to make sense of so much that's happening around us that otherwise makes no sense. It looks like something utterly unintelligible. This book will help you make sense of it in a way that we weren't able to see things before. And so for that, Jennifer, thank you for writing it. Everyone here, you need to cop a copy, no pun intended. You need to sit down and read with it. It'll change you for the better, I promise.
And there's that link right down there where you can just click purchase, and Labyrinth is standing by ready to provide you with that at a discount. And so, Jennifer, anything else you want to say in closing?
I just want to say thank you, everyone who organized this. Megan Levinson, Maria Whalen at Princeton University Press, Janie, thank you, Michael, thank you, and everyone who's in attendance. I know that people are so exhausted from looking at a computer screen, and so I'm really grateful that everyone who tuned in is here. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So for those of you who were here and you think you want a friend to have seen this, it will be up on Crowdcast as a replay within about 5 minutes of us closing down. That's what Crowdcast does. And then it will pop up on the library's YouTube channel probably within a day or two. So you can share this with friends who weren't able to make it here tonight, and also share the book, of course, as well. And so I just want to say thank you again to everybody who made this possible. It was a great conversation. It was so lovely to meet both of you, Jennifer and Michael. And thank you, Maria from the Princeton University Press. And thank you, Dorothea at Labyrinth Books. And that's about all. We're going to say good night.
Hi, everyone.
Good night, everybody.